Welcome, everyone. Have you ever wondered, is tradition ever good? Is it ever a good thing? I mean, where do we get the idea that tradition is bad? Or does it interfere with everyday functioning, or what? And I just got to thinking about this, and I have a new addition to my podcast team. I have a very generous students that have banded together to be my research and production team. And they suggested the idea, and I think it might be a good one just to explore a little bit tonight, is about tradition in the church specifically. And we'll try to unpack that a little bit more. The specific part of it is what we just passed. I mean, for a lot of people, they may know very well, depending on their faith tradition in church, about Ash Wednesday. And apparently in New Orleans, Fat Tuesday was not fat at all. If anything, it was quite lean, with barricades on the French Quarter. At least that's what I heard. And so we didn't really have much in the way of celebration before, in preparation for Ash Wednesday and what that represents. So I want to get into that a little bit. Before I do, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Ray Mitsch, your host for the Psych Monologues. This podcast is, I have realized that this podcast is actually sitting in the intersection between faith and psychology and transforming hearts. I have been wrestling over narrowing it down and getting a clear understanding of where we're heading, what we're doing, what I'm doing, and what I'm really about. And I think this is where I have begun to land, because it is psychology. I'm a psychologist. I think in psychological terms, but I also think in faith terms as well. And what relevance do those two things have? Because after all, being human means there's psychology, and having faith, do those two things play together at all? And I would suggest they do, actually. One actually deepens our understanding of the other in both directions. And so where does that take us? And I would suggest that actually takes us to transformed hearts. Because transformation is not about just moving the chairs around and calling it a new room, but it is actually participating in a metamorphosis, which is really what the Greek word is for transformation in the Scripture. So that's kind of where we're at, is this intersection of faith, psychology, and transformed hearts. The podcast is called The Psych Monologues. I am a professor of psychology at Colorado Christian University, and we are now in our 54th episode. It's just amazing that we've hung on this long. So here we are, Sunday evening, February 21st, and I have been chewing on this idea that the team gave me about tradition, and is it ever a good thing? Now, let me give you a little bit of a cultural education. Seems appropriate since I'm an educator. But the first thing that comes to my mind is, ironically, a musical I never watch. I don't even think about it, but it came to my mind, which is kind of a strange look inside this weird, twisted cranium of mine. And what came to my mind was a song, actually, which is really, really rare for me. But it's from the Fiddler on the Roof. And Fiddler on the Roof was released in 1971. I will not say how old I was at that time, and neither will I confirm or disconfirm the fact that I was alive during that time. But Fiddler on the Roof is about a small village, Jewish village in Tsarist Russia, and the main character is Teve. Teve is Reb Teve. I think I've got that right. Is the milkman, and he actually talks about at the very beginning, which is what I want to introduce you to, is the word tradition. And Lent, which we just passed on Wednesday into with Ash Wednesday, is a tradition. It is a church tradition. And so what I thought I would do is lift a little audio out of it so you could hear his thoughts about why tradition is so important. And once we come back, I will add in a little bit more for what of the other things that he mentioned about that, and then we'll drag this kicking and screaming into the discussion about Lent and why has it become so popular today. I've got a few answers from some of the things I've looked around at, and I've got a few of my own ideas about why it is it seems like, starting to get so popular. So here's the introduction to the movie. This movie just starts, literally. Doesn't have credits, doesn't have any of the other stuff. It just starts with Teve talking about tradition. So here we go.
A fiddler on the roof. Sounds crazy, no? But here, in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof, trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. It isn't easy. You may ask, why do we stay up there if it's so dangerous? Well, we stay because Anatevka is our home. And how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word. Tradition!
So what does he say? Every one of us is a fiddler on the roof. Every one of us is trying to scratch out a pleasant, simple tune without breaking his neck. But how do we keep our balance? That I can tell you in one word: tradition. And he goes on later in the clip here, and I won't share it with you or bore you with it, but he says, because of our traditions, we've kept our balance for many, many years. And ironically, with a touch of sarcasm and honesty, he says, how did this tradition get started? I don't know. Because of our traditions, everyone knows who he is and what God expects of him. It's an interesting perspective for sure. And some of the things that I have found as I've been looking around and reading some material and so forth, it tries to answer the question about why is it that Lent has become so popular today. And there are a couple things that caught my attention in this one article, and I think it's from the article Why Evangelicals Need Lent by Tim Suttle. And he says two things. One, an unsettled life. The average family will move almost 12 times in their life, so advancements in technology nearly double every year. Sociologists say that the cultural turnover rate may occur as quickly as every 7 years. So because everything is so new and constantly changing, it seems that we have this unconscious desire, and he uses the word subconscious, but I get a little queasy with that word because it's so undefined. But we have this desire to connect with something certain and unchanging, and long-standing traditions such as Lent seems to be an obvious fit. It kind of draws us to it because at least it's one thing that isn't changing with everything else in our lives that is. So that's the first thing. The second thing that caught my attention was the idea of being lovers of experience. He says this: our society has a double love of experience. Economically, most people can afford the goods and services they need, so experience is the last frontier. That's why we pay top dollar for unique experiences like floating diners in the sky, movie theaters that serve gourmet meals or drinks, Brazilian steakhouses that carve a king's feast at your table, which is really good. Philosophically, most people today believe that experience trumps reason. What we feel about something is more important than what somebody else says about it. in our experiencing loving culture, is it really a surprise that Lent has become so popular? And why? Because it creates a space for some experience of God, is one way to look at it. Now, just to put this into perspective, the reformers fought against the abuses of human tradition. That's what they dug their heels in, and ultimately they saw the church as controlling people through these traditions rather than setting people free to know Scripture on their own and to come to God as themselves without an intermediary. So that explains why so many of the reformers had really strong words against Lent. They were highlighting a very, very critical point, and that is that the grace of God, not the religious practices of men, is what forgives us and transforms us, which I think we can land on in large measure. But see, the thing that we contend with, and I had this conversation even in a group that I attended not too long ago, that really was very disparaging, even mocking about the idea of Lent and our attempts at worshiping a tradition rather than that tradition pointing us somewhere to know Jesus better. So some people would suggest that we can we can look at three different options when it comes to engaging the ideas and practices of the world around us. We can reject them out of hand as inappropriate, unhelpful, or whatever that may be. We can receive them as good and helpful, or we can redeem them by changing what is bad and reframing what is good, which I think there's potential in. Now, let me give you some background just from me. I grew up in a fairly traditional Lutheran, mainline Lutheran home. A Missouri Synod Lutheran would be the flavor of the hour when it came to that. And I went through catechism like most kids do. I went through, memorizing Scripture, all of that stuff. I was going to say jazz, but I don't want to be disrespectful. So I went through all of that stuff, and that's really what I came into, is a highly liturgical church and experience. And Lent and the calendar of Lent was just one of the calendars that we followed throughout the year. And there were some things about it, now being many, many years beyond that, and looking back at it and saying it captured the cycle of life, the things that change over time, and things like that. And it really did anchor the year. You kind of knew where you were by whatever tradition was being exercised or observed. And we have these. We still have these in the evangelical church. I mean, we do that around communion, and we celebrate communion. We're not going to pitch that. And certainly Jesus seemed to be very clear about the idea of fasting and it being part of it. So the thing we have to, I think, keep in mind is, without focusing on the grace of God, all fasting, whether Lenten or otherwise, is really nothing more than self-made religious tradition. And it's aimed at helping us feel righteous instead of what we do. So we have to grapple with that, I think, in a lot of ways when we talk about the idea of Lent and why it has become so popular and what is very much a part of our tradition around Lent, and how has it come to be that way. So is there a place for it? Yes, I think there is. I mean, I have not hidden the fact that I engage on a regular basis some ancient traditions, some ancient disciplines even, of silence and solitude. And that's not a common practice, at least in the evangelical church. It seems to be rising in profile, and people seem to be interested in this idea. Certainly the students that I have certainly found it to be very, very helpful. But the reality is that we have to kind of remind ourselves that the point of Lent has nothing to do with giving something up. It's not me being assigned another project to execute or another point of vigilance or another list of things to give up at all. What it's really about, like many of these ancient traditions and disciplines, is to reorient myself toward Jesus, and doing that on a daily basis. Now, further, let me just further kind of fill in the picture, rest of the picture here, is Lent actually is related to springtime, and it's 40 days that starts at Ash Wednesday and ends on Good Friday. And it's got significance, at least in Scripture, because of the 40 days idea. Jesus went into the desert to fast, and because he was fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. And we remember that indeed Moses did the same thing on Mount Sinai to receive the law. 40 nights, 40 days, 40 nights. It seems like this keeps getting repeated over and over again. And before too long, it got instituted into the church as kind of as a tradition to observe and prepare for Easter weekend, Easter. And we, again, our temptation is to solidify something into something more than it is, to try to bring it into alliance with, what we think is good, if you want to put it that way. Because the reality behind this is something that you can split between traditionalism and tradition. Because oftentimes we reject tradition at our own risk. Because rejecting tradition means submitting ourselves and our churches to the tyranny of the relevant, to chasing after the innovative, and oftentimes we resort or fall into an arrogance about that we're doing it better than anybody else, or we have more righteousness. It is embedded in our broken spiritual DNA. And so traditionalism is when we worship the traditions as though maintaining them is the whole point of faith. One theologian put it this way. He said, tradition is the living faith of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, which is profound. So tradition, rightly understood, actually allows our ancestors to teach us about engaging our faith in a different way. Now, I'll tell you right out of the gates, this is thoroughly atypical from where I have been in the past. I have been pretty much traditionally evangelical in terms of tradition and seeing it as an assault on a living faith, and yet there's some structure that it offers us that can be engaged in, because if we can split apart tradition as something that is intrusive and an imposition, and recognize that it was never meant for that. When you go back and look at even what God did with the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt, he gave them traditions to follow so that there was predictability and order. And predictability and order is not intrusive or an imposition, it is safety, which brings us to a bigger term that I think has gotten, I don't think people would really necessarily even connect it. And that term is boundaries. And see, I can just see some of my students' eyes rolling back in their head, and enough to be able to, see their brain. Because I talk about boundaries all the time, and we see boundaries and fences as keeping us from getting to things that we want, when in fact, boundaries and fences make it clear where our freedom is. And so having a fence or a boundary allows me to be very clear about what I'm responsible for and what I'm not. And tradition, rightly understood, accomplishes that same end. And so the tradition of Lent actually encourages us, even invites us to embrace what might be considered an intentional wilderness experience that helps us to break out of the patterns that anesthetize us to just everyday life. Because we go through our cycles and our rhythms, and we do our things day in and day out and do it exactly the same way. And it's almost like we've become automatons and we don't even see life anymore. And the reality of a vibrant, vital relationship with Jesus is having eyes wide open so that I can see the world around me and see it not just by having something register on my retina, but to see the movement of God around me. And that's a key understanding. And Lent is, in a lot of ways, a way of kind of ripping the blinders off and allows us to see the world in a little bit different way. So one person said it this way. He said, we fast, and in this case, he was talking about fasting, but he said we voluntarily switch off the lights in our daily routines, hoping that in the self-induced darkness, we might actually be able to see our way forward a little bit better. And see, we hate darkness. We hate uncertainty. We hate all of that because it assaults our sense of control. And when we voluntarily move into that, whatever it looks like, and it is tuning ourselves in, or maybe I should say retuning ourselves in to a life and a world around us that is saturated with God's movement. And so Aslan is always on the move, to borrow from Chronicles of Narnia. And the one thing I always point out to my students is, I point it out by asking a question. What's the question? So who is it in the Chronicles of Narnia who seemed always to see Aslan first? And more often than not, what you find is it was Lucy. And there's only one reason why. Because she was always looking for him. And that is where spiritual formation comes in. That is where the vital relationship of reorienting ourselves to what Jesus has for us, so that we can maybe see things a little bit differently. Because we see wilderness as a wasteland, when in fact a wilderness is a reintroduction to our hearts again in a lot of cases. And that's worth paying attention to, worth at least considering when we look at and observe Lent. Now, people today, being in the midst of a pandemic has been kind of interesting, that people will show up, certainly at CCU, with the ashes on their forehead. And before the pandemic, the priest would oftentimes put that on everybody's head. Why do they do that? To actually indicate the death that sin brings into our lives, and to point us toward realization of preparing our hearts ultimately for what we will commemorate, tradition of Good Friday and Saturday and then Easter Sunday. So tradition in and of itself is not bad. If anything, tradition rightly understood and rightly handled anchors us to long-standing beliefs and understandings of who Jesus is and what he is asking of us to move into, even with him. And living within the boundaries of what has been set to care for our own hearts, so that whatever I care for, I can then give away. And that's some thoughts on the whole idea of Lent and where it belongs within the conversation of even evangelicals, which is increasingly being recognized and understood. And that's something worth paying attention to, something worth thinking about in the next 40 days. Well, less now. We're like, 38, 39, 37 days. We can spend some time orienting our hearts to what Jesus is asking us of us. And you say, well, I don't hear anything. Well, maybe the person that you cross paths with tomorrow and you interact with could use some time of present listening, and that would be orienting toward where Jesus would have us in our relationship with one another, because ultimately we have an opportunity to be Jesus with skin on for them for the days to come, and this is a way for us to just orient ourselves to it. So, food for thought for the day. It is a interesting topic, to say the least, but I think it has some deep understanding to offer us in terms of our spiritual development and what goes into it. So, as always, at the end, I've got some really exciting news. I mentioned that at the last during the last podcast, just to wrap up the evening. And the news is this: is that you can now, those that are listening, those who are a part of this audience, is that you can partner with us to grow the scholarship fund by offering a tax-deductible gifts for the CCU Silent Retreat. So what that means is that I have partnered with another friend of mine who has a 501c3, and he has graciously offered to be our fiscal sponsor. And so any gifts that are offered for the Silent Retreats will now be tax deductible. And there is even an opportunity that if you want to support the podcast and into the future, the programmatic changes that we are hoping to institute, you can do so on the website. You can go to drmitch.com, and then this drop down under CCU, and then CCU Silent Retreats. And there is a button at the very bottom of the page for you to donate to our efforts at growing a scholarship fund for CCU students to be involved with the Silent Retreat. Secondarily, that also helps continue our development of the podcast to reach more people and talk more about the intersection of faith, psychology, and transformed hearts. So, a retreat's coming up April 8th through the 11th. You can sign up. We've had some bumps along the road in terms of trying to schedule these out, again, because of the pandemic and our site. So I'm trying to work that out. I don't know if that's going to work for the fall, but we'll be back strong in the spring and thereafter. So you can subscribe to any of the website. I already mentioned it, or on Instagram at the Psych Monologues, Facebook, Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn, Dr. Mitch. And the podcast itself can be found on any of the platforms that you might hit, whether that's Spotify or Stitcher or iTunes or Amazon Music or iHeartRadio. Any one of those has the podcast showing up there as well. So please join us. I'd be delighted to spend a half an hour of your time on a Sunday evening reflecting on the week past and looking forward to the week future, and try to talk about and unpack a variety of topics that are relevant to what we're going through right now, and then some other topics that have hit my radar really strongly that I want to spend some time talking about as well. So thanks so much for joining me. As always, love ya. Later.